A good lunch to you. You're at home while eating your lunch, or you're joining us over your lunch hour, uh, whatever the case may be. It's good to be with you. We have been the last couple of weeks working on Psalm 55, and we bring that to a close today, looking at verses 20 to 23. To refresh and remind you where we came from, and I kind of talked about it in the description of the video today. There is an occurrence during Absalom's revolt against David. Absalom being the son of David. Absalom was strong in terms, I think, physically strong. He was a very handsome, well put together young man. And he became quite infatuated with himself and his leadership abilities as opposed to his father. So he rises up in revolt against him. And one of David's close friends, now this is in the story from 2 Samuel, Ahithophel, yeah, and he betrays David. He is the high priest, and Absalom comes to him, and Ahithophel basically aids Absalom's rise to the throne and taking over of the kingdom of Israel from his father. Now, of course, that doesn't last. David does reclaim the throne. Absalom is killed. He gets caught in his hair in a tree. We are not 100% sure that Psalm 55 is this exact reference. Okay, there's nothing in the psalm itself that actually what's the word that uses his name or connects to Ahithophel in any specific way. But the context of the psalm leads us down this road, because unlike many of David's psalms, where David complains about the people, he's a lot of David's lament psalms are that his enemies or even his people are allied against him or are trying to destroy him. Enemies making more sense, like David's at war with the various tribes who weren't put out during the conquest in Joshua. He battles them for his whole life, and we know this is a certainty because after the whole Absalom event, the Lord tells him as such that warfare, blood shall never depart your reign, your kingdom. So David's at war with tribes and enemies. In the beginning, he's dealing with the fact that he's been anointed king and Saul has been anointed king. So there's a fair number of people in the kingdom who prefer Saul as opposed to David. So there's that as well. So, we have these various things that David has railed against in the past. Enemies, even sometimes the people of Israel. But this is unique, and maybe why we can point it at this moment, because David is just in the psalm heartbroken. He is torn apart because it's not an enemy, and it's not even one of his subjects, but it is someone who he considered his friend, someone who he considers, as it says in the text, his companion. So at verse 12, for it is not an enemy who taunts me that I could bear it. Right, so like used to that. It is not an adversary who deals insolent with me, then I could hide from them. Right, but it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. So this has led to this whole situation, or I should say, David's betrayal, or his friend and companion betraying him, has led to the crafting of the psalm. I think with a good amount of evidence, and I think it's a worthy connection. I think we connect this to this specific historical moment, right? And we have gone through verses 1 through 19 to that second Salah. We left off at the first Salah, which we believe is some kind of poetic reference, maybe to like the idea of a refrain, or there is some kind of idea or a song section, maybe there's a musical section. But we do know that these usually notate breaks in the structure or the story in the prose in the psalm. So we did read through verse 19 because that's where our second Salah left off. And we'll pick up at verse 20. We only have a couple verses today, verses 20 to 23, so we shouldn't be together too long, but we will, with vigor, we will close out this psalm, and hopefully maybe we can recap and think about some things learned, and things gained. Yeah. So start with verse 20. Salah yada bisloma hillel berato. Okay. Berato should be fairly familiar to you. And yada, his hands. Those are words we hear quite a lot. Berato is a word for covenant. Yeah. So he has put forth his hands against those who were at peace with him. So we have this bisloma. It's an interesting word because we have a preposition in front of shalom. So shalom is the word for peace, right? So the beith gives us a preposition, and that would lead us to understand. I think if I remember, the beith can be against, and I think in some instances can be like because. So we have the Be Shalom against peace, right? And then the Bisloma at the end we have a suffix which gives us number and gender. So we have this is third masculine singular, right? Yeah. Okay. So the hymn would be referring to the. So there's just to be we can be clear of what's going on here. There is a man. We would say it's his name is so strange here. I'll look out up again. We would say Ahithophel, right? But a betrayer, a companion who is a betrayer. Now, so this man, he has put forth his hands against those who are at peace with him. Now, in the very narrow context of or I should say the immediate context, David was at peace with Ahithophel, and Ahithophel has suddenly, maybe because of the way the winds are blowing, he knows David. David at this point is older. I think he's probably in his mid 50s. Absalom is young, he's strong. Maybe he looks at the situation and thinks to himself, well, David is not going to make it against his son, so I should back a winning horse. That's something like that. It seems strange because Ahithophel is a man who has peace with David, and suddenly he reaches out his hand to break that peace. Yeah. He has broken his covenant. Now, I would imagine his covenant is not. I mean, it could be God's covenant, but if that were the case, we would have gotten probably a different word. We probably would have got like Torah instead if it was God's covenant, right? Or a combination of the two, or something like that. So I think this is an agreement, a covenant between two people, right? He's broken that. He's broken faith. He's broken trust. We had a contract. We had an agreement, and he broke it. And the strange thing is, in the text, we don't really get any kind of sense as to why. What the oath breaker? What are his motivations? Why does he suddenly change his mind and move against the Berato, excuse me. Well, like I said, I think it had probably had to do with the fact of how Absalom had come to power, how he had, it was a very dramatic uprising. It was quick. Maybe Ahithophel thought Absalom's the guy. He's going to be the guy going forward. So, verse 20. Helaku Mahmaot. Let's see. Pu, I think, or Pew, something like that. Ukarab, Lebo, Raku, Debara, Misamem, Vehema, Petihot. Okay. Now it's interesting here, in English, of course, word order is going to matter. Yeah. In Hebrew, especially in the poetry, not as much, although oftentimes Hebrew word order in the sentence does matter. Greek really sometimes does, but most of the time you can put words almost in any place in the sentence. And by choosing where you put the words, you accentuate them. So that's what I bring up here is it really goes very roughly. We're smoother than butter were the words of his mouth, right? So he wants to, the psalmist wants to bring out this image. And perhaps he doesn't want the image, smoother than butter, to be, for sake of the pun, spoiled by the actual referent behind the analogy, so to speak, right? So when you say the words of his mouth were smoother than butter, you immediately start, because of the word order, you start with the words of his mouth and then you apply the metaphor, or maybe this would be better said, that this would it be simile? No, I think it's metaphor. Or is it just descriptive language? You would apply that to the idea of his words, where David kind of starts out in maybe a more interesting way, right? Because so if we're kind of reading as we go and experiencing the poetry as, so in other words, we've talked about this before in our Psalms Bible study, but the idea of poetry in general is that words are often smashed together in unique ways that you wouldn't speak in poetic verse, right? This is not how we talk, but how we order our words, how we kind of push them together, what thoughts we stack upon other thoughts, is where the poetry comes from. You see, and if we're kind of reading them, we kind of think of the words being an image as it comes by, and it's conjuring up images in our head. It's conjuring up thoughts and philosophical thoughts and wisdom. It's conjuring up things inside our head that we can think about and meditate on. Right. I had a Professor Sleska. I shouldn't quote him on this because I could be wrong on this, but I seem to remember him coming and doing a presentation to our Minnesota North district when I was still in Minnesota North. And he kind of even talked about this idea of like almost like now again, I don't want to quote him out of context, but kind of like this idea of a magic 8-ball where where you would shake them and then the words would come up and then you turn it and that little die inside would go away and then it would come back up again. But in this context, these words are coming up and we're seeing them. They're kind of crossing our face and they exist in kind of one moment in time. Right? If you're a ancient Hebrew audience, you're listening to Psalm being read, you're probably not necessarily in front of the manuscript, right? So if you approach it as you're listening to it, as it's conjuring up these ideas, it's coming forth in this manner, almost this like kind of ticker tape or a ticker, right, where you're seeing a word at a time, and then it goes away and it goes away and it's just coming. So he starts with smoother than butter. So the very first image that comes into our head is this idea of when the cream and the stuff rises to the top, and then you make butter and it's creamy and it's smooth. So you have this image in your head, creamy and smooth were the words of his mouth. right? So it lets your mind run free on the image first, then we connect it to the words of his mouth, right? And I almost think that it makes the words more nefarious. It makes them a little more, like, for lack of a word, evil or betrayal minded. Right? I mean, if that's such a thing, but I think betrayal is such a personal thing. It hurts so much. Um, so yeah, like uh, smoother than butter, right? Were the words of his mouth. These words of betrayal. Yeah, and I think David's referring to the fact that he spoke to David in these ways with smooth, gentle, you know, butter-like words, and all along, Ahithophel was going to betray him, right? Smoother than butter were the words of his mouth, but um, Ukarab, was in his heart. Levo. So we have lave, which is the word for heart, and then we have a suffix at the end, which gives us the number and gender, right? So his heart, this third masculine singular, so it's his heart, right? Um, softer than oil, right? Now this one flip flops it. We get softer his words than oil. Okay. Um, Still works. Interesting, right? Dabaru. So dabar is the Hebrew word for word, dabar, and uh, uh, then oil, misamen. I'm curious what the root word of misamen is. I wonder if it's misam. Oh, a shaman, shaman. Okay, so this is like not oil in the sense that we would think of, but like olive oil or the oil from fat from animals. Yeah. So we have two of the same kind of ideas, right? Butter and this oil, right? So softer his words than oil. So his words were softer than oil, and yet. So we have this vav here, which, remember, vav can be either connective in terms of a simple conjunction and, or it can be the opposite. It can be an adversative conjunction. So now we're going to be like but, right? Oh, now the Hebrew, the translation here goes a yet and yet instead of but same idea. You could say just but they were drawn swords. Yeah. Let's look at this petty hot. What's the root of that? Petika, and it just means a drawn sword. Nothing big here. Oh, this is a fun one though. Hey, check this out. Pedikah is the Hebrew word for drawn sword. The only reference of pedikah in the Old Testament is 55:21. That's it. It's not used anywhere else in the scriptures. Now, of course, we should remember that the Hebrew language does exist in other sources, even historical sources as old as the Bible, in other things. There are Hebrew. Um, you have like stuff like the Talmuds. That wouldn't be probably the same time period, but you've got other books, perhaps other scrolls being read or being written, excuse me. But yeah, this is the only reference, the only time Pentecost is used in the Bible. Stuff like that, by the way, just a side note, as kind of a tangent, stuff like this made translating very complicated because you ended up having to look up a lot of words. Um, because the problem is all Hebrew words are three letter roots, right? So the problem would be is the word itself in the text, right, has one, two, three, four, has 5 letters. So okay, these 5 letters is the root these 3, or is the root these three, or is the root these three, right? And there were times where you might have that word, and technically there was a root that could have been this or this or this. So you have to kind of go through the Brown Driver Briggs, which was a concordance, and try to find the word exactly to figure it out. And when you get a reference where there's only one in the entire Bible, it makes it that much harder to find. So yeah, translation of Psalms can be very complicated. Okay, last two verses. Hazlek al Yahweh, Yahabeka, Vehu, Yekale, yeah, I'm sorry, Yekal Keleka. Yeah, there it is. Yekal Keleka, Lo Yatin, Leolam, Mot, Lesadik. That's 22. So you recognize some words here, like Yahweh. You probably heard that, and Lo, which is the negative particle, um, and then Leolam. We've had that one before, and Zadik, which is righteousness. Right. So we've had these words before as well. So cast on Yahweh. Hazlek is to cast. Let's look that word up. That might be interesting for us to understand, like what that means to cast. So to throw, to fling, to cast. I wonder if this has anything to do with. So we have. It looks like it's more like throwing things away from yourself. I was thinking maybe it had something to do with like fishing, but it doesn't seem to be. Most of the fishing, I think, in that country at that time would have probably been, as opposed to fishing rod fishing, would have been like net fishing. Um, so this idea that we have of casting would be unusual. Okay. Throw away, cast off, cast down. Hurl, pluck is another one. That's interesting. Okay, so pretty straightforward. This idea of kind of throwing something away from yourself, like this idea of cast. So cast on Yahweh, Yahabeka, your burden. Yeah. Uh, this is from Yahav probably. A lot, what is given, and then or burden from Yahav, which is to give or to ascribe. So, in other words, cast on the Lord the things that have been given to you, i.e., burden. In this case, of course, there's specific things like, well, if it is Ahithophel, right? If this is this story, so the burden of being on the run again, the burden of being betrayed by your friends, the burden of now you're at active war against Absalom and his forces. So these burdens, David's saying, cast them on the Lord. Very typical too, if I'm not mistaken. I think, if I remember correctly, let's check this out. I'm pretty sure that 55 is a lament psalm. So this follows the order pretty well, which is, yeah, it's an individual lament. So it follows the order pretty well, where it is serving as a thing, kind of usually the steps are you're going to call out to Yahweh, kind of inducing him to listen, to my pleas. Then you're going to have a lot of the discussion about what's happening, right? So that's fallen in spades. And then usually they kind of close with a call again to trust in the Lord. And the one thing that we're missing here that usually is in there somewhere would be, which we did kind of have in verse like 19. Actually, yeah, like Let's take a look at sections 17 through 19. Yeah, so like verses 16 through 18, David's recounting, or I should say he's maybe making more of a confession of faith. He's not recounting past things, but he's making a confession. I call to God and the Lord saves me. Now, oftentimes in a lament psalm, the key to interpreting and getting from a place of distress to a place of faith or confidence is to call upon or to bring up past actions. So look at what God did in the past. We point out either the Red Sea, or we point out the conquest of the tribes, or David's ascent to the throne, and the many ways in which God like literally saved David's own life. He'll bring up these things, say, the Lord did this in the past. He will take care of me again in the future. We don't really get that here, like those specific kind of references to historical truth that he did in the past. But we do get this section where David is kind of confidently remembering how God has helped, but he doesn't really give him us. He doesn't give these moments any kind of specificity. This is what God will do. The psalm ends like most lament psalms do, moving from a place of anxiety and being unsure to a place of faith and being sure at the end, right? And that's what's going on here, right? We got to verse 22, right? So the psalmist has taken you through this trip, and now he's encouraging you now to turn back to the Lord and put your faith and your trust in Him, right? Even though you're going through whatever you're going through, David has specific things here. Cast your burden to the Lord, and He will sustain you. He will never permit the righteous to be moved, right? And then last verse 23, Ve'ata Elohim toredem leber sahat anse damim umirma lo yehezu yemehim va'ani ebta bak. Okay, but you, God, Elohim, God, we've heard that word before, but you, God, shall bring them down to the pit of destruction. Who? Well, the ones who have betrayed David, the ones who, and we have to kind of connect the dots here. David's the anointed king. Standing against the anointed king is standing against God's good and gracious will. It would very much be like the Pharisees opposing Jesus. When the Pharisees oppose Jesus, they're actually opposing the good and gracious will of God the Father. The creator of the cosmos, the order of all things, the one who defines all good. I mean, it's crazy to stand against our Father. And when you disagree with or even attack the Son, that's what you're doing. And in a smaller way, standing against David, attacking his reign, because God has said, no, David's king, not Absalom, David's king. And when you go against God's good and gracious rule by persecuting and hurting David, you're going against God's good and great. You're just as much attacking God's created order, his rule and reign in the world, right? But you, God, shall bring them down to it. So what happens? If you stand against God's reign, God is going to destroy you. He's going to judge you and destroy you. Men of bloodthirstiness and deceit not shall live out half their days, right? So bloodthirsty and deceitful men, right, will not live out half their days. But I, Ebtah, will trust Ba'ach in you. I think, anecdotally, David's life proves that fact. David outlives a lot of his enemies. He outlives a lot of his contemporaries. He comes out of a lot of scrapes and a lot of strange situations unscathed. So I think David has the right to make that claim, right? Um, since he puts his trust in God, he's come through a lot of difficult situations. Whereas men who are deceitful and bloodthirsty, they don't live very long. There was I think it was a proverb we talked about not too long ago. There was actually, it was a while ago, but it was just talking about how men who do evil can look forward to that evil unraveling them or being unraveled upon them, right? So like you do a crime with three other guys, and then you get caught, and the two other guys roll on you, so that they get off and you get prison time, and that shouldn't surprise you, because you allied yourself with evil men. What were you expecting them to be righteous now when they had everything to lose and little to gain? Of course they're going to roll on you. Why wouldn't you expect that? Same thing's true here. Men who are bloodthirsty and deceitful, probably because the fact that they're bloodthirsty and deceitful won't live out their lives to its fullest or to its length of days, whereas someone who trusts in the Lord will. You know, um, and we could even talk about this in the context of so Jesus does this better than anyone. And of course, he's cut down when he's probably 33, 34. He doesn't live to be old age. But Jesus rises from the dead and lives to all eternity, just as all people who put their trust in God. So maybe the days here aren't necessarily earthly days, but they're days of salvation, eternal life. Yeah. And those days will be numerous, right? Um, so, Psalm 55, a psalm of lament, probably talking about a historical event of Ahithophel's betrayal because of Absalom's uprising against David. And it, so, maybe some recap ideas. It gives us some hope. David maintains his faith even when betrayed by a close companion. The worst kind of maybe mental anguish a person can go through. And David remains faithful. And he puts his trust in God. So we live in unprecedented times. Who knows what will come next? And it's good for us to know that as David persevered, so can we. Yeah. It hurt his heart. It grieved his soul, but he trusted in the Lord, and he knew that at the end, that is where his treasure was. That is where his life was, right? That's where his many days of his life will be, is not worrying about whether my friends are all going to be faithful to me, but whether the Lord is going to lengthen my days. What else? Any other closing thoughts? Yeah, I tell you what. If you have any additional questions or closing ideas, comments, concerns, leave a comment, and I will come back, and maybe next week before we start off on our next psalm, I'll answer those. Maybe there were some things in the early first part that you wanted to ask questions on and never got around to. So feel free to leave a comment or a like, and let me know if you have any closing questions. But the kind of closing idea that a lament psalm is always meant to move us through a place of anxiety or anger, sadness, depression, and move us to a place where we trust in God. We have our faith in God. I think that is definitely what this psalm has done. So, Lord's blessings to you on this Thursday. Have a blessed weekend. We hope to see you at church on Sunday morning, and God's blessings to each of you.